Hello all, this is NaveenPrabhu. Today we are going to look at the game between Robert Byrne and Bobby Fischer. This game featured in the US Championship in the year 1963 in the New York City. And here, before we are starting the game, I want to tell you that Bobby Fischer was on the winning streak. He wants to win this game also. Let's see what happened in the game. And Bond also don't want to win this game. You want to just a draw in this game because you don't want to push the game and give a win to Bobby Fischer. So he tries to play the safe in this game. Here he goes for the queen's pawn opening. That is, he plays d4, and here Bobby usually goes for the king's Indian defense. That is, usual plan of putting his knight on f6 and pushing the pawn and financiating his bishop and going for a castle, and later climbing some space in the center. That was his usual plan in every move he plays as a black here. Here Bond goes for a c4 push, and he continues his plan of pushing g3, and here he also wants to financiate his bishop and gain access to this diagonal. So here Bobby goes for a immediate climb in the center. So he pushes c6 to ready his pawn to push for a d5 here. Here he goes for bishop to g2, and here he goes for d5, climbing a space in the center, and after the pawn captures, he captures back. And now he just puts a pressure on this d5 pawn with the move knight to f3, knight to c3, and here he just financiated the bishop and ready for the castle here. Here he goes for an e3 push, and here he just castles in the situation, and the white also readying for a castle. He puts his knight here, and Bobby goes for a knight to c6 here. White castles in the situation, and here as you see, I actually mentioned that Bobby is on a winning stage. Byrne doesn't want to push something here, so Bobby has to win this game to continue his streak. So he wants to push something in this variation. So he goes for something like some sequence of moves that also copied by Byrne himself. That is, he goes for p6, so Byrne goes for b3, and here Bobby goes for bishop a3, idea of pinning the knight so that the knight can't move. Then the rook hangs here, and here also Byrne just goes for a same continuation. That is, he puts his bishop on a3, and as you see, the position is somewhat symmetrical. The 3 pawns in this variation and the king, rook are all symmetrical in this variation. You see the queen, the pawn, everything is symmetrical in this variation. This is somewhat a rare condition in this variation. There is no piece has been captured here. As you see, the knight and this pawn are being the two pieces that is not symmetrical in this variation. And now you see the bishop is actually pinning this pawn so that the pawn can't move forward. So he moves his rook to e8 and unpinning the pawn and preparing to move the pawn to e5. And here he goes for queen to d2, and if Bobby wants to win, he have to push to e5, and he also mentioned that pushing to e5 will just draw the game, because by playing safe we can't able to win the game in any situation. We have to go for some sort of attacks here. So Bobby goes for immediate e5 push, and he wants to open up the position and goes for some sort of attacks here. And he also mentioned that Bobby mentioned that he's just a bit worried about the d5 pawn, because that will be a lone pawn in this variation. It is easy for white to attack with his knight and the bishop and the queen, and we can also put a rook and start an attack on this pawn. But in the game, he just trades the pawn here, and after the knight captures, any player wants to put his rook here and start attacking here. And the biggest question is which rook to put on d1. And in the game, he goes for a rook f to d1, but idea of putting this rook here and wants to put this rook in the open file and start attacking. But the correct move in the situation was to put this rook in the d1 square. Actually, Whenever the question arises which rook to place on this square, it is very hard to find the correct rook in any situation like this. Here he also made a mistake by putting this rook on d1 because this allows Bobby to go for this continuation. And as you see, this rook is doing a pretty job sitting on the f1 square, actually guarding the f2 pawn in this situation, which is so good in this variation. But now he just moves that rook to d2. You may just ask what happens to f2 pawn, there is no attacks coming. You will see what will happen in the game here. Here he goes for rook f d1 and Bobby goes for knight to d3, completely blocking this queen and the rook here, cutting off the attack on the d5. And so Byrne want to trade this knight here, so he moves his queen away so that he can just capture with the rook, and after the bishop captures he can pick up with this queen here. Getting a 2 piece for a rook is a really great thing for white in this position because our 2 minor pieces are stronger than the rook here. But in the game, Bobby just goes for a capture on f2. That is, I have actually mentioned that the rook on f1 is doing a very great job protecting this f2 square. If the rook stays on f1, the rook can capture this pawn and there is nothing to worry about the situation. But here the knight captures and the king have to capture the knight here because there is no good move for white in this situation. Otherwise, he will be just a pawn down for nothing in this variation. So the the king have to capture, and the continuation was to give him this check. And there are some choices for white to move. That is, his king can come up or goes back in this variation. But all leads to a disaster because if the king comes to, sorry about that, if the king comes to f3, that is a mate in 4 in this situation. We will just capture with our rook, and after the king captures, we will just give this check, and after queen blocks, we will capture back. King comes to f4. That is, bishop to h6 is a mate here, so that can't be possible for the king to come up in the board. So if the king goes to e1, it is also not good because after we captures, and it is easy for us to capture this bishop, and it also forking the queen and the rook in this variation. This is so good here, but actually we don't even need to capture our bishop here. We can just simply play our queen to f1 and create an immense attack on this variation. And as also see, our rook is against the king. It is very hard for the white to survey in this position. So king to e1 is also not possible. And if king to f1 is also not possible because it just forked the king and the queen in this variation, and it also forks the rook and the bishop. It is a family fork in this variation, so it is not possible. So Byrne knows that. He goes for king to g3, g1 here, and here Bobby just captured the pawn and forks the queen, rook and the bishop here. And so Byrne just moves the queen and creates some sort of pressure on the d5 square, and every player will just goes for a rook capture in this variation. But Bobby didn't go for a rook captures. He goes for a knight captures g2 because he knows that the bishop on g2 is much stronger than the rook on d1 because the bishop is the only saving piece around the king here. There is no other pieces around the king in this variation. So Bobby goes for a knight captures g2, and after the king captures, there is an important move to play in this variation. That is, we have to open out this diagonal for our bishop to come to b7 and start attacking the king. So he goes for a d4 push. This is an important move to play on. If he doesn't place this move, the knight will just occupy the d4 square, and it will not be possible for Bobby to advance the pawn in this variation and create this diagonal here. So he goes for a d4 here, and the knight captures here, and here Bobby gives him this check, and the king goes to f1 in this variation. But what happens if the king goes to g1? That's an interesting continuation because if the king goes to g1 here, we can just capture this knight here, and after the queen captures, we have an intermediate to move to play on this situation. That is, we can just deliver this check here, and after the rook captures here, we can just capture the queen in this variation, and it is a pretty much winning position for black here. Or else, if the king moves forward, we can just capture the queen, and after the rook captures, we can just capture the rook, and it is also a winning position for us. So you can't go to king to g1 here. He can also consider going to king to h3, but coming up the board is too dangerous to play on for the white king here, because we will just start giving the check and this diagonal is cut. The king can't escape here. You have to block here. We can just start advancing and create some sort of attack here, and it is not easy for white to survive in this position. So that can't be possible here. And king to f2 is too dangerous. We can just start with queen to d7 and putting our queen on h3, and giving this checkmate is really amazing. The queen can just give this check, and it is very hard for white to survive here. So considering all this in the game, Byrne just goes for a king to f1. Here we can't just capture the knight, and after the queen captures, we can give this check, because when we give this check, the king can just capture here, and there our Byrne queen is well protected on d4, so that plan cannot be possible in this variation. So Bobby made his first move of his queen here, that is, he placed the queen to d7, and there are two grandmasters commentating on this game here to the live audience watching there, and they said that after this move they just started shaking the hands and left the table, and they said that Bobby Fischer just resigned the game because he is actually a material down and there is no compensation in the game. But later the two commentators came to know that Bobby Fischer just won the game, that is the Byrne who resigned the game in this position, because there is an interesting continuation. As I told you earlier, the queen is coming to h3 and there is no more saving the white king. Actually the rook is also cutting this diagonal, the bishop cutting this diagonal, and it is hard for the white king to survive in this position. And Bob Fischer also a bit worried about the game has not been finished fully. He has an interesting continuation to play that. He thought that the queen may come to f2 in this variation. That's the best move for white here. After the queen comes here, as per the game, this move, but queen to d7, the game has been over. Byrne resigned the game. Let me show you what Bobby Fischer had in the mind. He thought that queen to f2 was an interesting defense here, but here Bobby can just give the check, and the only move was to move the king to g1. The queen can't block because we will just pick up the queen with the support of our bishop here. So the king have to come to g1, and Bobby can just deliver this check, and after the rook captures, we will just capture the knight here, and the queen can't capture here because of this checkmate here. So the queen will be dropped in few moves, and the king can't able to survive with this pressure of the bishop and the queen here. So black is winning here. So Byrne knows that, so he resigned with the move queen to d7 in this position. That's all about the game. I hope you guys enjoy the video. Please hit the like button. Keep supporting this channel. Thank you for your support. This is NaveenPrabhu signing off.